Good evening, everybody. We are starting a session on STAR, the STAR session by Max Sakir in collaboration with the Physician Forum of India. This particular program is in 6 modules. The objective of this module is to create awareness and bring out the how to early diagnose and manage the stroke patient. It is going to be in 6 modules, as I said before, and we are going to learn from experts in the field. Our principal speaker is Dr. Rajshekhar Reddy. He doesn't require much introduction in the forum, but nonetheless, he is a head at the moment, head of the neurology department in the Max Sakir, and he is also been in the Department of Neurology in Max Sakir for a while, since 2012. Earlier also he was there in the neurology department. He has a large number of papers, international and national journal, attended many seminars, given a lot of talks. He's got a lot of chapters in the textbooks as well as in articles. So we are, and then I would say Dr. Rajshekhar Reddy, a great neurophysician and of course a great human being. We're going to learn a lot from Dr. Rajshekhar Reddy. May I request Dr. Rajshekhar Reddy to take over the session and carry forward, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the very, very kind introduction, and I hope I'm audible to everybody. And I'm happy to be here at the Physician Forum of India again. I have been associated with them since 2005. I think I've been in Max now since 2005, and it's been about 17 years. So even before the pandemic, we used to get it up. Can you hear me? Sorry. We had an opportunity to meet in person, but I think hopefully that will happen soon again. In the meantime, we have to try and continue. And I know that the Physician Forum of India has been doing a fabulous job in doing under the aegis of Dr. Chauhan, you, yourself, Dr. Gupta, all of you have been doing, Dr. Tulsi. I remember all of you have been doing such a fantastic job for so many years, learning and teaching. Both ways it has always been whenever I've come to this forum. So the idea of doing these sessions today, these 6 sessions which have been monthly, are really because I felt, and I think that a lot of neurologists and physicians would also agree, that stroke is sometimes not as seen as importantly or treated as appropriately as, let's say, a heart attack today. So there have been many ways to try and rename it, make it a brain attack, etc. And what we have seen is that we want people, both doctors and the general public, to be more aware of the immediate therapies that can be done so that the patients have much better recovery than having a debilitated, chronically ill state where they are getting physiotherapy for years and years, and sometimes in that situation becoming a burden to their family and of course their own suffering, which can go on for years and years. So the whole idea here was there were 6 modules that we've thought of as a team. So the first module today is about the basics of stroke, just the very, very basics, and the next will follow, which will be stroke versus non-stroke, where I'm going to deal with stroke mimics and what can happen in that situation. The third module is about the shorter window of opportunity in stroke. So when a patient with stroke comes in, when you have the standard shorter windows, what to do, and then extended window, which is the longer window of option. What are the options one can have, or what can one do to the patient if a patient comes in, let's say, after 23 hours of a stroke or 24? What are the things that we can do? And then, importantly, this will be the 5th talk about the prevention of stroke. Of course, when patients have this problem, we want them to be treated immediately and treated as best as we can. But of course, we must also do prevention of stroke. And the last talk is going to be about intracranial bleeds and their management. So, see, we understand, of course, I'm going to tell you a little bit about that in the basics of stroke. Most strokes are ischemic, but there is a proportion of strokes that are hemorrhagic and how to deal with them. During the last 2 talks, the 4th and the 6th talk, I will be joined by my interventional neuroradiologist, Dr. Himanshu Agarwal, as well as my Director of Neurosurgery, the Senior Director of Neurosurgery, Dr. Bipin Walia. When we are dealing with intracranial bleeds, he will give the neurosurgical perspective and how to manage that. And of course, Dr. Himanshu Agarwal will tell us about intervention. I'm sure he'll show a lot of very interesting videos during those talks. So my talk today, and I'll go to sharing the screen straight away, and please do tell me if my audio is not clear. Anybody can tell me from the organizational team. Right, so today is the first module of my 6 talks, and today I'm going to talk about only the basics of stroke. And my overview of the talk today is going to be about the statistics of strokes in India. What are the burden of stroke, and what are the few, well, let's say the data that is available about what kind of strokes we have in our country, how we classify strokes, what are the common causes and risk factors of strokes, what is the importance of recognizing these early warning signs and symptoms, how to recognize these and how to be fast, and I'll go to talk about a little bit about that mnemonic here. The different types of stroke presentation, what is the history and the physical examination that one must do, and it's going to be an overview of this, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end. What are the common and other relevant stroke investigations that must be done? I will expand on something called the 8 Ds of stroke, which all of us should remember. And what is the algorithm for stroke patients? When a patient comes with stroke, what is the way to actually go down a flow chart and how to manage these patients? And I'll just summarize this towards the end. So to start with, we don't have a great deal of data about strokes in our country, but we've had some data, and there is an ICMR-funded task force which was, using the Indian Stroke Association, able to look at the amount of stroke burden that we have in our country. And they estimated that 1.8 million people suffer from a stroke in India every year. And this has almost increased 100% in the past decade. So there has been a massive exponential increase in the last 10 years. Now, this stroke attributes to 30% of the overall morbidity. So it's not just the people who actually are dying from stroke, but people who are surviving also. They are incapacitated, they are bedridden, like I said, they are a burden on their family, there is a financial as well as emotional burden which is there. So it attributes to almost, it contributes to about 30% of overall morbidity in the country. So it's a large proportion of the people who are suffering and bedridden in our country. One Indian suffers from a stroke every 20 seconds. So you get Indians having a stroke every minute. And the risk of stroke, which is similar to the rest of the people in the world, is 1 in 5 for women and 1 in 6 for men in India. So that's, again, you see the risk of stroke. So you're talking about huge populations here. If you're talking about 1 in 5, it's about 20% of the population of women and almost 13-14% of the population of men in India. They're all at risk of stroke. So that is the kind of data. We know that this is a big burden on our country, and we must understand more about it and be able to do more about it as soon as we identify these patients. So if you look at, apart from the fact that it can be fatal, it can lead to permanent disability if not treated in time. So every second actually counts, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. But you can see here the data that is available to us tells us that on average a patient waits for nearly 13 hours after experiencing the first symptom of stroke before seeking medical care. And this is clearly because of lack of knowledge, possibly among us doctors as well as among the general public, who are waiting for such a long time before they actually go in to see somebody who is appropriate. And 42% of the patients, nearly half the patients, wait for up to 24 hours. And once that happens, we've lost the important golden hours of the stroke. And this in spite of the fact that we know today that every stroke, a person ages by 36 years in terms of functional age. So when a person has a stroke, he's actually aged 36 years. Imagine if you're 60 years old, you actually become 96 years old by the time you've had a stroke. So that is the kind of functional aging that takes place. So we know that apart from paralysis, there has been going to be loss of function such as speech, movement, and memory. And we must try to restore blood supply to the ischemic areas, especially in ischemic stroke, as soon as possible. So if you look at 0 minutes, which is the onset of stroke symptom, we have therapies which are available, which between 3 and 4.5 hours can be given, which is a clot dissolving drugs such as alteplase or RTPA. And this is used for both mild, moderate, and severe stroke. And beyond that, there are newer methods that are going to be used, which I'm going to talk about later, not today in today's talk, but there is mechanical thrombectomy and other modalities of therapy which are now available. How to select patients who've come in the longer window, and how to use the longer window of opportunity to treat these patients. So if you look at the different types of stroke subtypes in the studies conducted in India, about 75% are ischemic strokes, and about 20% are intracranial hemorrhages, and 5% are subarachnoid hemorrhages. Now this is a slightly different number that you would get from the West, where the amount of hemorrhages, which the internal hemorrhages and all hemorrhages seem to be about 15 to 18%. But in India, we seem to have a slightly higher proportion of hemorrhagic stroke. But even then, at least 75 to 80% of patients are today of ischemic stroke. Other rarer causes of stroke, such as CVT and other unspecified types, account for very, very small proportion. Now, if you look at the types of ischemic stroke that are there, so now ischemic stroke can be further subdivided depending on what the cause of the stroke is. So large artery atherosclerosis, which is basically carotid disease and anything that is caused from any stroke that is caused from that area, account for about, I would imagine, about 50%. Cardioembolic stroke, which is from the heart, is about 22%, and small vessel or intracranial occlusions are about 20%. So this is a proportion of these strokes, but I'll tell you that at least another 20% of strokes come under ESUS, or embolic strokes of unspecified source. So we really don't know where they have come from. So this is different data, again, depending on who you look at. But I'd imagine that I always tell my patients that 25 to 30% of these strokes arise from the heart, 25 to 30% arise from the carotid neck vessel, 20% from intracranial disease, and 20% we're not really sure even after evaluating in detail. When you look at hemorrhagic stroke, mostly hemorrhagic strokes are intracerebral, and a very small proportion of strokes, such as we see sometimes in younger people, are subarachnoid hemorrhages, and in that case, of course, the management completely is missed. So, broadly speaking, like I said, ischemic stroke as well as hemorrhagic stroke. How does ischemic stroke happen? The commonest cause I told you was carotid artery disease. So you have a blood clot which breaks off from a plaque built up in the carotid artery, and this can travel into the cerebral circulation. It finally reaches an area where there's a blood vessel which is narrow, or the large clot tends to just block the blood vessel, and this area of brain will not get blood, and that will get damaged. I'm going to show you a 2-minute video, and you'll have to bear with me for this video. This is again very basic, but it sort of tells us everything about ischemic strokes and how they happen. It's just a good graphic representation, so I felt that I should share it with you. The audio will come on in a few seconds, and you can let me know if it isn't there.
A stroke occurs when the blood flow in part of your brain is blocked. After just a few minutes, the starved brain cells begin to die. Normally, the brain receives blood via 2 major pairs of arteries, which branch throughout brain tissue and supply your brain cells with a constant flow of oxygen, glucose, and nutrients necessary for their functions. In one type of stroke, ischemic stroke, an artery in your brain narrows or becomes completely blocked, preventing normal blood flow. The blockage may be caused by a blood clot, also called a thrombus, which forms in an unhealthy artery of the brain. The lack of blood flow causes the tissue the artery supplies to become starved or ischemic. Similarly, the blockage may be due to an embolus, a blood clot that forms elsewhere in the body and travels to the brain. The embolus lodges in a narrowed artery and obstructs blood flow.
So I will not go into the treatment of stroke, but just to, to the next important cause of stroke as we know it here today. As you saw from the previous video, they've shown you clearly how cardioembolic strokes occur, and sometimes, there are artery-to-artery embolism which also occurs. The other causes of stroke are, like I said, a large proportion in our country, which is about again, thought to be about 20%, is hemorrhagic stroke. And this can happen because of two principal ways. One is intracranial hemorrhages, which are largely because of high blood pressure. And like I said, the rarer cause, which is called an aneurysmal subarachnoid hemorrhage, where there's a leakage of a blood vessel. So again, a small video, again about a minute or so, to show you about hemorrhagic strokes. And I will just...
Constant flow of oxygen, glucose, and necessary for their functions. During a hemorrhagic stroke, abnormal bleeding disrupts normal blood flow. For example, in an intracerebral hemorrhagic stroke, a blood vessel bursts, spilling blood directly onto your brain, while robbing the intended tissue of nourishment. Both the hemorrhage and lack of blood supply, called ischemia, destroy brain tissue. A subarachnoid hemorrhagic stroke occurs when a weak spot in a blood vessel wall, called an aneurysm, bursts and leaks blood into the tight space between your brain and your skull. The high-pressure bleeding results in serious damage to brain tissue. Immediate treatment for your stroke may help to minimize brain cell injury and death in the case of hemorrhagic stroke. Emergency surgery may be necessary to repair damaged arteries or reduce the pressure of the blood on your brain. You may be given medication to help the brain's blood flow return to normal.
I hope those two videos which I shared were very, very basic videos, but I think that they were very clear in the sense that you saw exactly what happens in the most simple ways in ischemic stroke as well as hemorrhagic stroke. Now, we know what happens. Now, why does this happen, and what are the risk factors of stroke, and what should we look at? So we know that certain risk factors which are there are non-modifiable risk factors. We know that age is a non-modifiable risk factor. People, when they get older, are going to have a higher incidence of stroke. The risk of stroke increases after the age of 55. Every decade, you can see the risk of stroke actually doubling in that sort of thing. Female sex has a slightly higher incidence of stroke than men at the, if you look at the overall data. In early life, women possibly have a higher incidence of stroke as compared to men as a result of possibly hormonal issues, as well as we know that certain strokes occur in the postpartum state because that itself is a hypercoagulable state. And then as the years pass, the men tend to get slightly equal to women, but eventually women are thought to have a slightly higher risk of stroke and higher incidence of stroke, possibly because of increased longevity. In terms of lifespan, they live longer than men in the West, and whatever data we have from there tells us that the incidence of stroke is higher in women than in men. Race and ethnicity plays a role, and again, we know that certain types of genetic predisposition can occur. We know that these people who are from certain, let's say, risk groups, especially in the US, for example, the African Americans will have a higher risk of stroke than other people. So these are what we call non-modifiable risk factors. Now, when we look at the other risk factors, there are certain modifiable risk factors, and I'll go into these two separately as what doctors can treat and what patients can treat. So just having hypertension, one could argue that this is let's say, you can't control having hypertension, but it is a modifiable risk factor that one can treat. So hypertension has a very strong linear correlation with the incidence of stroke. And this is the strongest indication of the strongest association, strongest risk factor which is there with the development of stroke. Apart from that, there is diabetes mellitus, which is also a very well-known risk factor for stroke. It's known that about 20% of people with diabetes will eventually end up having a stroke. And even people with slightly higher sugars, we know that they're going to be at higher risk of stroke than normal people. So it's recommended that even if a person has a stroke, you should try to keep the sugars between 140 and 180 milligrams. Dyslipidemia, that can cause stroke. We know that if you have a high cholesterol, there is going to be increased atherosclerosis, there will be increased carotid plaquing, and that can result in an increased incidence of stroke, and at least a twofold increase of risk of stroke is seen with hyperlipidemia. It has an inverse relationship with hemorrhagic stroke in some controversial studies, but mostly we know that the common dyslipidemias which we try to treat are such that they actually increase the incidence of ischemic stroke. Atrial fibrillation again contributes to this is a much recognized and an important cause of strokes now, especially in the elderly people. We know that about 15% of all strokes actually could be cardioembolic and due to atrial fibrillation. And if we monitor people for a longer time, if we do Holters for people who had stroke, we will pick up more and more atrial fibrillation in these people. Now, these are all risk factors that patients have, and they can be treated by doctors. But there are certain risk factors that patients have, and the doctors must encourage these patients to give up such habits that can increase the risk of stroke. Smoking is the number one risk factor, and sometimes I've seen patients who come in with stroke and they've actually continued to smoke 3 months or 6 months later, and then they come in to me and ask them why they're still smoking, and they say that nobody's actually told them to stop. Now, that is something that is unacceptable, and this is one of the biggest risk factors for atherosclerosis, both coronary and cerebrovascular, so we must encourage patients and tell them that they must stop. Alcohol, again, even a modest amount of alcohol intake can increase the risk of stroke, and large amounts of alcohol, we say it has a J-shaped curve with hemorrhagic stroke. So when you start drinking alcohol, they say there is actually some protection, but as this protection is also controversial, but as you continue to drink more and more, there is going to be an increased risk of hemorrhagic stroke. Drug abuse, we know methamphetamines, cocaine, blood pressure surges occur, and people are going to be prone to hemorrhagic stroke. Physical inactivity will also important. Physical inactivity and diet, both of these things are going to indirectly affect the cholesterol, the lipid profile, the sugars, the kind of blood pressure a person has depending on what kind of salt he has in his diet. So these are all modifiable risk factors that must be addressed by all doctors when we are taking care of patients who are at risk of stroke or who had a stroke. So we know today that there is, just to recap my talk, we have two basic types of stroke. One is ischemic stroke and the second is hemorrhagic. Ischemic is much more common than hemorrhagic. There are some subtypes of hemorrhagic that require immediate intervention. In ischemic strokes, we know that there are certain risk factors which must be identified and they must be treated as soon as possible. Now, what does one do when a person has had a stroke? So what is the importance of recognizing early warning signs and the symptoms of stroke? Acting fast can make a very, very, very big difference. The guidelines that have been laid down by the best societies in the world, including the American Heart Association, the American Stroke Association, says that people treated with thrombolytics within 4.5 hours of symptom onset have a much greater chance of recovering without major disability. The World Stroke Organization says that recognizing the signs and symptoms of stroke early, treating it as a medical emergency with admission to a specialized stroke unit and access to best professional care can substantially improve outcomes. So the best authorities in the world are saying recognize and treat early. Now, let me go a little bit about why we have to do this. So I'm going to talk about this concept called the core and the penumbra. So the core is the part of the area of the brain that is not getting blood at all and has completely died, and there's the area or a tissue at risk which is called the penumbra. So in the absence of viable blood flow, available energy can maintain neuronal activity only for about 2 to 3 minutes. So once we've reached beyond that time, and we know that normal blood flow is about 50 to 55 ml per 100 milligrams per minute of the brain, and in ischemia this reduces to almost 20% of that, and in the infarcted area, which is the dead tissue, it can be even further, as less than 10 ml per 100 grams per minute. We know that there will be a central area of irreversibly infarcted tissue, which is called the core, surrounded by an area which is potentially salvageable, which is called the penumbra. And we know that this is a dynamic process. So as time passes, as you can see on this plot, you're seeing 1 hour, 3 hours, 12 hours. The ischemic core is exponentially increasing in size, and the penumbra is obviously becoming smaller. If the ischemic core remains the same size, then the penumbra will be large for a little while, and then over a period of time, when normal circulation takes place, it will actually reduce in size. But if we don't treat, what happens? So if you have a person with a middle cerebral artery occlusion, and here you can see the infarcted area is shown in red, the penumbra is seen in green, and the penumbra is basically moderately ischemic tissue, and that is salvageable for a few hours. And thrombolysis or any treatment in such a situation needs to be done as soon as possible to prevent the green area becoming red. And this is 6 hours, and within 24 hours, if you don't treat, this is what happens. You will have a much larger infarct size, and of course there will be an area of risk which is still there because of edema, because of other changes, cytotoxic edema, vasogenic edema that happens, and that area will still be at risk, but the infarct size, which is the irreversible area of damage, has now become much larger. So we have the potential to reverse this neurological impairment and this damage to the brain. And you can see on the left this ischemic core with brain tissues which are destined to die and a penumbra which is around that. If you treat properly, then all you will see is a slightly enlarged ischemic core, but the rest of the penumbra is back to normal. And reperfusion, either by therapy such as TPA or mechanical thrombectomies and procedures to try and improve blood flow to the brain, both are going to reduce the extent of ischemic injury. Now, this is again a time is brain concept, and you can see on this the impact of what you see on the y-axis. On the x-axis you're seeing the minutes, the hours, the time and the day, and you can see per stroke 1.2 billion neurons are lost, and the number of synapses lost are 8.3 trillion. Myelinated fibers are lost to the tune of 7,140 kilometers, and this results in accelerated aging of 36 years. Every hour, 120 million neurons are lost, 830 billion synapses are lost, 714 kilometers of myelinated fibers, and 3.6 years of accelerated aging. And per minute, 1.9 million neurons are lost. So you can see, and every second how many? You're losing 8.7 hours of your life in every second of the stroke. So it tells us that when you have a person in this situation, you should try not to waste even 1 second. Every minute, every second is important. So the amount of damage that is occurring so rapidly must be addressed as fast with the most urgency that one can have. So it is a very simple thing to show you the effect of time. So when we treat a patient who's coming with a stroke between 3 to 4.5 hours, and when we do the best possible therapy such as thrombolysis, the number needed to treat, NNT, which is a very good guideline to tell us how medication works, is 14. That means you need to give 14 patients this therapy to have one desired. And when that window period reduces between 1.5 hours to 3 hours, the number needed to treat falls to 9. So within this, these 9 patients are given, and one will have a desired perfect outcome. And this further reduces to 4.5 patients if you do it within the first 1.5 hours. So the faster you treat, the more patients are benefited. And that is the important message that needs to be given to everybody who is involved with patients who have stroke, or relatives of patients who had stroke, and just generally everybody needs to be made aware of this data. And today, though this is the basics, I want to emphasize here that the standard of therapy is thrombolysis, and we must treat these patients when they come in within the window period as soon as possible with this appropriate therapy that is available. But in spite of all that we do, we realize that worldwide at the moment, only 2 to 12% of eligible acute ischemic stroke patients actually receive thrombolysis. And in most patients who receive this, the door to needle time is more than an hour. And this is because of various factors, and I'll go into that later. But what's being seen is that the faster we treat these patients, the earlier we treat these patients, they're always going to do better. And that's the fact that I want to emphasize. So, how do we recognize a stroke? How do we tell patients and attendants and everybody else, and even as doctors attend them? We look at this very nice mnemonic called be fast. So B is balance. If a patient starts having unsteadiness, incoordination, is not able to walk clear properly, and there's a history that this has started very abruptly, this is something that must be immediately seen as a warning sign of stroke. You look at symptoms related to the eye. If a patient starts saying that they're not able to see clearly, or if suddenly vision has gone away in one eye, or if they start saying that they're seeing double, they're not being able to see, they're seeing objects shaking, that is a sign of stroke. And the moment these things happen, you must look at these 4 other things. Now, when I say F is actually face here. If there is any facial asymmetry, if the face goes to one side, if there is any kind of lopsided smile that the patient has. When the patient has, when you look at the arms for A, then you ask the patient to put their arms out. If they are having a drop in their arm, if they're not able to lift up their arms on one side, or even the leg in such a situation, if there is any change in the speech, if the patient is unable to say words clearly, or is stuttering or slurring, and the speech is unclear, that would be a warning. And with all this, be fast, which is balance, eyes, face, arms, speech. Do not waste time. So this is an easy to remember thing. I'm sorry about the F showing as fast, it should show face. But the moment you have anything like this, the patient should immediately be referred to a center which can manage this situation. Now, I'm just going to go basically into the different brain areas, just to tell you that there is a gamut of symptomatology that the patient can come with. So it's not always very similar, but that mnemonic is enough to identify most patients with stroke. But even then, there are certain areas of the brain that can get damaged in slightly different ways, and it's a good idea to have some basic knowledge about what happens in these areas. So suppose you have involvement of the frontal lobe, which is a large area of the brain. Sometimes it just results in difficulty or weakness in one part of the body, on the opposite side. They can have trouble in speaking or not able to speak fluently, but their comprehension may be preserved. And I've seen some people with this situation being treated by being sent to a psychiatrist and actually being referred to psychiatrists in this situation. And mood changes and social behavioral changes are also part of frontal lobe function. And if there's damage to these areas, that can also occur. But usually that is not a common presentation of stroke. That occurs more in infections and sometimes in situation like if a person has a space-occupying lesion in that area. That's the usual. Strokes don't usually present with an abrupt mood change or agitated delirium, so I don't think that should be something we should think about. Now, the second lobe is the temporal lobe. Again, you have commonly language disturbance, especially if it's a dominant temporal lobe. Here the patient is able to speak fluently, but does not seem to comprehend very well, and has sometimes jargon speech, starts using different letters, not able to explain themselves very well. Again, I've seen situations where people with this kind of symptom onset have gone to a psychiatrist first because they're talking gibberish and the attendants are just not understanding what has happened, and they just take them to a psychiatrist, and before the psychiatrist obviously identifies these problems and sends them to us, but by the time they've reached a hospital, often very valuable time has passed. And there are rarer presentations like prosopagnosia, etc., which again, we should know, but these are not common presentations. So, again, there are different types of language disturbances that can occur depending on which part of the brain is involved. And this is the parietal lobe. You can have difficulty with word finding, sometimes difficulty in writing, reading, difficulty in calculations. All these things happen, and they may not be very evident when the patient comes with a stroke. But when we test these patients and these areas are damaged, these are things that we often see in these patients. The occipital lobe is predominantly for vision, and if a patient comes in with bilateral visual loss, then you want to suspect that there is likely a problem in the occipital lobe. Again, positive visual phenomena such as hallucinations are not a common manifestation of stroke. I keep putting these things here so that I want to tell you that they are not common. Sometimes people will come and say that, look, I'm seeing a bright light or a sparkling thing in the field of vision. That is not how normally strokes present. Strokes present with negative phenomena more than positive phenomena. So you will have a loss of function rather than an exaggerated function in patients with ischemic. If you have an occipital lobe tumor, you're more likely to have positive phenomena because of the irritation of the lobe, and then as a result of that, they can have positive phenomena. If there's an involvement of the brainstem, there can be commonly swallowing difficulty. Vertigo is a very common thing, and of course there is inability to balance or coordinate. And again, patients may have a lot of visual disturbances. When I say vertigo, one should always remember that isolated vertigo is unlikely to be due to the brain. So when a patient comes in with acute vestibular syndrome, like very severe vertigo, um, it could be peripheral as a result of inner ear disturbances or central as a result of brain disturbances. Statistically, peripheral problems are much more common as compared to central. And usually, when a person has a central cause of vertigo, then there are other symptoms that would be there or other signs that should be there, and it would never be usually isolated for that. So that's something that one must remember. Again, I've spoken about the cerebellum earlier, but this is again, usually people will come with incoordination, inability to stand, walk clearly, and just because of the similar lack of control on the articulatory apparatus, on their lips, their tongue, their voice box, they're unable to speak clearly, and they may have a slurred, drunken speech. So I tell patients that the cerebellum is the area which gets affected when one has had too much alcohol. So most people recognize, with the help of the knowledge that has been spread through our movies, what a person behaves like when he is under or inebriated, and that is exactly what would happen in a person who's had a stroke in the cerebellum. So we know that when these patients come in, we must do a very detailed history and physical examination without wasting time. And we must remember the ABCD, what we learned in medical school. So we do ABC, which is airway, breathing, circulation. Then we look at D, which is important for our patients. With stroke, you look at the deficit. Is it a mild, moderate, or severe deficit? And this would be important in deciding the kind of therapy that we're going to do. We look at duration. The second D is duration. Is it the patient between a window period to give IV medication, or is it a window for a mechanical thrombectomy or a bridging therapy where you do both, or is the patient completely out of the window? And the third is the drug. Is the patient on any particular medication, such as an anticoagulant or an antiplatelet, has something been administered very recently, which is also going to sometimes affect the immediate acute therapy that one may need to do. So after we've done that, we look at the important investigation that must be done, and these include doing a blood glucose, doing an ECG. The blood glucose is done because you do not want hypoglycemia or hyperglycemia, which can sometimes mimic a stroke. We don't want to miss that. Also, if you have very high sugars or very low sugars, it can sometimes impact the thrombolytic therapy, so we need to keep that in mind. ECG is to show us atrial fibrillation, and if such is the case, then we know that our choice of anticoagulation or therapy later may be affected by that. So we have two modalities of imaging a patient. So this is the blood test that you do in the emergency, and you want to quickly do a quick brain imaging. Now, both these brain modalities are excellent modalities to diagnose stroke, but to my mind, the CT scan with the CT angiogram is the one that wastes less time. The purpose of doing a CT scan is predominantly to rule out a bleed. If a person has a bleed, we will not do certain therapies which have to be done in an acute ischemic stroke straight away. So you don't need to do more than that sometimes. And a CT angiogram is essential these days in every person who's had an acute stroke, because we want to decide at that point if they are a candidate for doing any further interventions such as mechanical blood retrieval or any other endovascular procedures, because you can have a large artery stroke and you have a CT scan that shows no bleed and the CT looks alright, you thrombolize the patient, but sometimes if they have a very proximal large vessel occlusion, the outcomes with just plain thrombolysis may not always be good. Again, this is not a rule, so many people do well even with large vessel occlusion when you do thrombolytic therapy, which is the TPA. But it is important that you recognize that if there is a large vessel occlusion, you may want to do further endovascular therapies to try and open up these vessels mechanically and improve their outcomes. Now, MRIs are also very, very good tools, but the problem with an MRI is that it takes a little longer. So sometimes when you think that you have a little more time and you have some time to make a decision, so let's say a person is out of the window period, it's come with a 9-10 hour old stroke. At that point, an MRI will come in handy to try and confirm the stroke and also give us more information about the area of the brain at risk. And again, the MR angiogram, just like a CT angiogram, tells us of the vasculature and any kind of significant narrowing. So it just takes a little more time, and it's not the first choice in my mind, but it's still a very, very good tool. In most cases, like I said, CT scan is sufficient. And there are other modalities we can extend a little bit. We can do perfusion imaging, which is available both with CT and MR perfusion techniques are there, by which we can actually look at areas at risk, and we can identify certain patients who may have a certain area at risk of the brain, and whether any further therapy than what we have done to prevent that area at risk, the penumbra, from getting further damage. There are certain modalities of imaging that can be used for that also. So I've already explained that angiography is critical in these acute stroke patients to decide therapy. And the reason for that, like I told you, is sometimes by giving acute therapies such as thrombolytic agents, we may not always be able to open out large vessels which are blocked, like the proximal MCA or the internal carotid artery. And if such a vessel is there, then after thrombolysis with IV TPA, one would have to do mechanical procedures to remove blood. And that has been shown to improve outcomes remarkably. So in good centers, we have a 24-hour interventional neuroradiologist who's available at all times, and we've done this very frequently and have had excellent results. So this is something that we must remember, and that patients' attendants have to be told that sometimes there may be, even an angiography, just like we do a coronary angiography, an angiography of the brain will be done to try and open out these clots. So again, an interesting mnemonic, which is the 8 Ds of stroke care. The first important thing is detection, and I said that we must be fast there. We must detect and recognize stroke. The moment we recognize the stroke, we must dispatch the patient to an appropriate center where he can be taken care of. And once he is delivered in that center, we say the door is the time he reaches the emergency. And from that time, there should be no time wasted. The door to needle time when he's getting that therapy must be as little as possible, and we must try and reduce it. There have been centers in the West that have reduced it to as little as 10, 12 minutes, and because they've had the ability to image some of these patients in a stroke sort of equipped ambulance which has a CT scan in it. So they've actually arrived with a diagnosis, and they've been thrombolized as soon as they've arrived there. We must look at the data. We must look at the data, which is the blood sugars. You want to make sure that the ECG is done. You want to look at some basic data, and depending on that, of course, imaging, etc. And then you make a decision whether you want to do IV thrombolysis or whether you do not want to do IV thrombolysis. Would you like a surgeon to see the patient immediately if it's a massive, large stroke which is likely to have a lot of mass effect, and you think that a neurosurgical team needs to be involved. So many decisions need to be taken at that point of time. Of course, a neurointerventionist also has to be there to make that decision along with us. And then you decide about the drug and the device, and then it's been shown after you've done whatever best therapy that you thought at that time, the best outcomes are in either a good ICU or a stroke unit, preferably a stroke unit which is staffed by stroke trained nurses as well as intensivists who have a special training. So best outcomes are there. So these are the 8 Ds, and I'll go through that again: detection, dispatch, delivery, door of the emergency, look at the data, make an appropriate decision, then decide about drug and device, and then the disposition of the patient. So the algorithm here is that if you have a patient who's coming with stroke, and this is a very simplified algorithm, if the stroke symptoms resolve, also it is important to look at all the history that is available and make sure that the patient is assessed quickly in a center which is stroke ready, so that even if, like I said, so I keep repeating this to patients, I keep telling patient families, if you've recovered well after a warning attack, you are our best patient, because you're the one who we need to keep normal. Once a patient had a stroke, often after we've done our best therapies also, there might be some deficit. So if a patient has had a TIA and recovered, he is the most important patient to make sure that you don't want to lose any function. Here is a patient who is completely intact, so why would you want to lose any function? And if a patient has a persistent stroke or something within 24 hours, you want to, in a center where, again, if facilities such as imaging, thrombolysis, mechanical thrombectomy, they should be there within 24 hours. And like I said earlier, the earlier they are there, the better the outcome will be. And then you have unusual situations where a patient may have altered consciousness, etc. And that again will require certain assessment before anything is done in the acute period. So that's the rough algorithm for stroke patients. And I'm going to briefly talk about something called the ABCD2 score, and this is for transient ischemic attacks. These are my last 2 or 3 slides before we go to the questions. So if you have this ABCD2 score, it helps us determine the risk of a recurrence of a stroke in a patient who is presented with a TIA. So you look at age more than 60 years, which is 1 point, a blood pressure at the time of diagnosis, which is more than 140/90. You look at clinical features, you score a maximum of 2 if there's unilateral weakness, and if there is speech difficulty only without weakness, you score 1. If the duration of this TIA was more than 60 minutes, you score 2. If it's between 10 to 59 minutes, 1. If it's less than 10 minutes, 0. And if the patient is diabetic, you score 1. So the maximum score here is 7. Now, the risk of a stroke following a TIA with these various ABCD2 scores is the following, as you see here. If you have a low score, within 2 days the risk is about 1%, and at 90 days it's about 3.1%. And if you have a high score, which is 6 to 7, the risk within 2 days is 8.1% and about 18% by the 90 days. So it's important to identify patients at risk of stroke, see all these, this is a very, very simple, and people have extended it and they validated it in other ways. There's an extended ABCD2 version with including other features and all that. But this is a very, very simple way to look at the risk of stroke following a TIA in patients who come. These are easy to remember points: the age, the blood pressure, the clinical features, duration, and diabetes. So D2 is duration and diabetes, C is clinical features, B is blood pressure, and A is age. It's not difficult to remember it all. So this is something which is very useful. So what are my messages today? 1, you have to be fast. And I'm going to say that again. Look at balance, eye, look at face, arms, speech. Don't waste time. Be fast to recognize the signs of stroke. Take a quick history and physical examination. That's very important in stroke diagnosis. Common investigations are just a CT scan and a couple of blood investigations. That should be sufficient to start therapies in good center. Ideally, a patient should be referred to a center where there is facilities such as imaging, thrombolysis, and mechanical thrombectomy, because now today this is also considered standard of care. This is not only done for patients who, let us say, can afford it or who are, not doing well. This is the standard of care in certain, and there are certain criteria for that, which we'll take up in the next few talks. So, my message today is time is brain, act fast. And you see this, weighing scale I've put on the right and the left. So in the weighing scale, you see the heart and the brain. I'm saying that our general perception over the last, let's say, 50 years has been that the heart is very important and the brain is not. Or somehow, I'm not just saying, maybe I'm saying that incorrectly, somehow the notion that the heart needs to be treated in an emergent manner is a pervasive opinion all across both patient population as well as, in the public as well as among doctors. Not so much the brain. And we want to change that. And I think that you will see on the right the scale that tells us that time and brain are equal. So if you want to save brain, you must not waste time. And each second is important. So the faster we do this, we know that we will save more and more brain. And I think that, to me, if I had to summarize the basics of a stroke talk, I would just want people to take one message home. The message being that each second is important. Each second is important, and time is brain, and we must do everything the moment we identify a patient with stroke, and do everything to try and save as much brain as possible. So thank you for that very patient hearing. I will stop my talk and hand over back to Dr. Mathur sir.
Thank you, Dr. Reddy. It was a lovely talk, highlighting the importance of stroke. And you brought out the point that the types of stroke, the prevention, the modified factor, unmodified factor, modified by doctor, modified by the patient, and the highlighting to the time. The importance which you given the be fast is the one thing which we all should remember. and should implement in lateral split as being told to us by Dr. Red. It is one of the wonderful talks, sir. We really get highlighted the treatment modalities. Doctors knows about it, but how to handle it is important. And the be fast, I repeat again, is the highlight of the whole talk. Thank you so much for a lovely talk. I don't want to further talk about it. We have few questions from the chat box. I'll share with you.
Sure.
One of the questions is from Dr. Manish Gupta. Excellent crisp talk presented, sir. Which is the most dangerous area for the stroke to happen? The thalamus. That was his question.
So strokes unfortunately can occur both in eloquent and non-eloquent cortex. So whenever we have a patient with a stroke in a, let's say, relatively silent area of the brain, you may not get very evident deficit. So there are two things when you look at when you say what is the dangerous area. One is the size of the stroke. The larger the stroke is, the more brain tissue is lost. But there can be a large stroke in an area of the brain which is not very apparently eloquent. So suppose somebody has a right-sided large parietal stroke. When you actually see the patient, he may not have much deficit except for some left-hand paresis. But if you do deeper testing, you will see a lot of functional loss. And that will not be evident in his everyday thing. Whereas a very small stroke, a tiny 2-3 millimeter stroke in the internal capsule can result in a large hemiplegia and a large deficit. So when you say dangerous stroke, danger can mean both a large stroke in the brain with a lot of volume loss and a risk of hemorrhagic transformation and mass effect as a result of that, and even a tiny stroke in, let us say, the internal capsule. You have a lateral medullary syndrome. The lateral medullary syndrome is a very small stroke. It's a very tiny area of the brain, but it subserves a lot of function. So when a person has a stroke in that area, he's very symptomatic. He can't swallow, he's having nasal regurgitation, he's having vertigo, he's vomiting, he's sick, he's got one-sided hemianesthesia. So it can be very, very disturbing. So when we talk about danger, I think that it's size as well as location which determine the danger. And all strokes are dangerous. So if you think that, if we today assume that, look, hemorrhagic strokes are very bad, but ischemic strokes are okay, there is data to show that people who had ischemic strokes, 40% don't survive 2 years. So it is not as a benign a condition as it's thought of, that people think, okay, you had a stroke and there'll be some disability. So we want to do everything to help patients recover. We want to make sure that they don't have these strokes. So I hope in the next few talks we'll be able to address all such questions.
Thank you, sir. I hope, Dr. Manish, you are satisfied with the answer. Dr. Sushil Chauhan has wrote something in the chat box, but I don't see any question. Sushil, you have any question? I have not read here. Another question from Dr. Shusuf Almas. How to manage a patient in a remote area showing symptoms of stroke?
Right. Dr. Shusuf, that's a very good question, sir. Many areas are resource poor, but see, suppose I tell a person that, look, ischemic strokes are much more common than hemorrhagic strokes. 80% are ischemic, 20% are hemorrhagic. So किसी को stroke हुआ तो we can just give them an antiplatelet straight away because chances are कि ischemic ही होगा, is not correct. Because clinically, even at a post-DM level, it has been seen that it is not sometimes possible to differentiate an ischemic stroke from a hemorrhagic stroke. So there are certain features that can tell us it is a hemorrhagic stroke. But if we put DM students on that, we've seen that they get it wrong 1 out of 3 times. So you don't want a hemorrhagic stroke to be given an antiplatelet. You want an ischemic stroke. Ideally, any person who has a stroke must have at least a CT scan. That's all is required. We don't need any other test. If a CT scan is done, then you are sure that there is no bleeding. Then you can give a blood thinner safely. If the patient is in a remote area and has not got access to interventions, then as soon as possible, I would imagine that antiplatelet at least must be given, and we must hope that we don't have anything that would, be more amenable to, that they had something that would be more amenable to therapy, but that is something one can't do very much about. CT scan is essential.
Sir, just to query that, CT scan is really not possible in the periphery of the country.
Right.
And it's very difficult, and the what time, generally the stroke suppose takes late in the night, and most of the CT centers are not functioning. So we left high and dry there, is it possible to give them some ecosprin or some disprin and some statins as a conservative before go for TPA?
So, sir, the point here is that absolutely, ideally one would not like to give any antiplatelet before intervention. But that's not such a problem. My bigger concern is that if we have an intracranial bleed that we are mistaking as a ischemic stroke, by giving them antiplatelets, then the effect of antiplatelet lasts a long time, and the deleterious effect of that cannot be reversed easily. Because you don't have a reversal agent for, let's say somebody is loaded somebody with disprin, and suddenly they have turned out to be a large bleed. That person's bleeding may potentially get much worse. So that is the concern that we have. Not so much the ischemic.
No, really appreciate, but sometimes you left high and dry in the periphery. What to do?
It's a very tricky question, sir.
Yeah.
Like I said, sir, see, suppose you have a person who's had an ischemic stroke and you give them aspirin and they come into the hospital, there is no problem. So, if a person comes into the hospital, we will not give them antiplatelets before doing intervention.
Yeah.
But if a person has been given disprin at home and brought to the hospital and requires an thrombolysis or a mechanical, it will be done. We will not deny it because the person has been given the disprin. Okay. But bleed will get worse. That is something we need to do.
But clinically, sorry to further say, clinically the hemorrhagic stroke is more sudden and ischemic is gradual.
So you can have maximum deficited onset in ischemic also. The ways that some people would want to clinically differentiate a hemorrhagic stroke is they have very high blood pressures. If your blood pressure is 240 by 130 or 220 by 120 suddenly, if the patient is having a lot of raised ICP features suddenly, where they are throwing up, vomiting, and they are, they say that if you've had trouble doing an MRI for a patient because he is restless and unable to lie flat, there's a chance that it will be a hemorrhagic stroke rather than a ischemic stroke. But I'm saying, sir, these can all occur in posterior circulation ischemic strokes also. So all these symptoms that I'm talking about, if you have a sudden posterior circulation stroke involving the cerebellum, patient can have severe headache, hypertension, and have vomiting and look very sick. So we don't want to, confuse that patient. That's the one that we don't want to miss. That's our worry.
Thank you, sir. There are no more questions chat box. I now request Dr. Helen Parasar to come and he's the Senior Vice President of South Delhi IMA.
Oh,
this program is also affiliated with the IMA. May I request Dr. Parasar is on line to say a word of thanks? Dr. Parasar, are you there? Sorry, I think he's busy. Since no more question and no more day talks, I would like to thank you once again for a lovely talk. Very, very, I like to further say EBCD2 is what we talked about in TIA, which we see in our general practice very often. It's very important to carry patients home and we must accept them. Thank you, Dr. Reddy, once again.